Now, just a little warning before we begin that there will be some major spoilers in this video for the second episode of Loki, or the episode called The Variant. So if you have not seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Okay, so I think by far the biggest issue I saw people having with the first episode of this series, or just the whole premise in general, is that everything we learned about the TVA and the Timekeepers and all of that seems to destroy free will in the MCU, as far as we can tell anyway. Basically, there's something or someone always there behind the scenes, making sure what's supposed to happen actually happens, that no one ever technically does what they want to do. Which then also brings up all sorts of questions, like what's the point of Doctor Strange looking at millions of possible outcomes in Infinity War if the TVA is just going to make sure the one that needs to happen is the one that actually happens? Now, sure, it's dramatic in the moment, in the movie, but in hindsight, it now seems that the 1 in 14 million possibility was always just going to come about no matter what, that Tony Stark was always meant to sacrifice himself in the end, that he had no other choice really, which feels like it diminishes the sacrifice itself. We even then saw in the first episode last week that they have a drawer full of Infinity Stones that they use as paperweights because to them they have no real power or meaning or purpose. Loki even says, or asks the question, if this is the TVA and the Timekeepers, the ultimate power in the universe, which right now at least it seems to be, which just kind of deflates everything we have seen happen previously with all of those Infinity Stones. And look, before going on here, let me just say that I am, thus far, enjoying the series and finding it interesting and intriguing in and of itself. I do like it, but the jury is still out on how much I'll like or won't like how this fits into the larger MCU, and I'm really covering a lot of the questions I've seen people bringing up in this past week since that first episode. And I do have to imagine they, meaning the masterminds at Marvel, have a well thought out plan here in regards to all of it, that they have to know that people were going to watch that first episode and be upset that they essentially took away free will in the MCU, and thus turned 20-some movies over the last decade, and a few shows now, into nothing more than events that were supposed to happen a certain way according to the greatest power in the universe, instead of events determined by the actual choices and actions of the heroes against the villains. And this second episode does begin to address all this, which again leads me to believe and hope they foresaw all this and it's just part of the plan. Because Loki brings up how the only ones who actually seem to have any sort of free will are those in the TVA. But at the same time, we learn they can't even do anything with that free will. They can't do anything but take free will away from other people. They can't even take a day off to go ride a jet ski, for example. So what's the point of having free will when the only thing you do with it is restrict free will of others? That said, though, I do think they're laying the foundation here for a possible sort of turn for Agent Mobius. Not that he'll become a villain or anything, but I think he'll ultimately turn from the TVA and have to choose at some point between fixing everything or not. A choice between resetting it all back to the one timeline, to the sacred timeline, or to let the multiverse and free will exist. And he'll, of course, let the multiverse carry on. And we'll have a fun and frivolous post-credit scene after the whole series is over of him riding a jet ski in some parallel universe where it's the 1990s on Earth again. I mean, we know one way or another this series will end with the multiverse intact. The title of the next Doctor Strange movie gives that away after all. We also know the next Spider-Man movie will delve into the multiverse as well. And so, oddly enough, it feels like the whole purpose of this show is to bring about a multiverse, one that we already thought existed, and to give it very concrete rules as to how it works, to sort of turn time travel and the MCU multiverse into a more hard magic system instead of a soft one, if you will. And though sure, Endgame left us with a lot of questions as to how time travel and the multiverse and all of this works in the MCU, I don't know that we needed it explained so thoroughly in response. Sometimes a mystery is just fun in and of itself. Not to mention, time travel is one of those things that's really near impossible to do perfectly, I think. And oftentimes, the more you try to explain your system or give an explanation, the more you unravel it, the more it just makes less sense. Though, yes, they did promise the way it works in the MCU once completely explained by this series would make it airtight, which almost makes this series their way of saying how clever we are with our time travel and the multiverse, though maybe the Loki series or with this character is the perfect place for explaining such a thing, Because again, I am enjoying it. I love Loki in this series, or Tom Hiddleston's portrayal of him, and I am intrigued by everything that's going on, and I don't want to pass final judgment till we see how the whole series plays out, but I do have a lot of questions that I hope don't become genuine unresolved issues in the end. And one problem I'm very much having right now is that the TVA doesn't seem to be very bright all around. They never once thought about Loki's apocalypse theory, if you will, which is something he apparently realized day one on the job, where what happens or the particulars before a catastrophic event can change without creating a new branch in the timeline, since it all gets wiped away anyway, which makes it a good place for the variants to hide. It also would make it a good time and place for Agent Mobius to take out a jet ski, but like I said, I'm expecting that at the end of the series. Then the TVA also seemed to completely miss or not think of what the other variant Loki might be planning to do with all the reset charges she was taking, that she might put them at all these different times and places on the sacred timeline to sort of bomb it and create all these Nexus events that would spawn new timelines all at once. And she seemed to pick some very specific times and places, including a lot of times and places on Earth for some reason, but she also picked other very significant places on the more cosmic scale, such as Asgard, Titan, Vormir, and Ego, which makes me wonder if this somehow will all tie into the upcoming Marvel What If series, or if it'll maybe somehow be more relevant to this show still. Hard to say. Either way, the TVA now has a lot of timelines to go ahead and try to wipe away before the multiverse is created, and who knows what happens next. And speaking of all this, am I the only one who thinks that destroying all these branching timelines, which is what the TVA exists to do, is extremely harsh when you really stop and think about it? Because a new timeline is not just a new timeline, it's essentially a whole new and very populated universe. I mean, Thanos was a villain for wiping out half of a universe just one time, and he was doing it to try and save it long term. But the TVA is regularly wiping out entire universes, again filled with people, unless I'm missing or not understanding something here, which seems possible, maybe even likely. And you might say, well, they're only destroying branching universes that, according to them and the Timekeepers, aren't even supposed to exist. But try explaining that to the people in that new branching timeline. For example, imagine if, wherever you are in the world right now, the TVA showed up and told you that you or we are all part of a timeline that branched off from a main timeline and that we're all going to be eliminated because we shouldn't exist. I don't know how comforting it would be, if at all, to know the main timeline would still exist and carry on, but you and us in this reality here and now would be no more. And we do know they are unique people in these branching timelines, otherwise variants wouldn't exist, would they? Another thing I find a bit confusing is that everything that happens in the sacred timeline seems to be sort of relative or happens relative to what's happening in the TVA, wherever that place actually exists. And it seems to be some sort of pocket dimension, for a lack of a better name or way of putting it. Even when a new branch forms, they have to go to it in real time, if you will, because it's unstable or some such thing as it expands and they can't go back to its beginning, which is just a major plot convenience because otherwise there would be no show or series, not if they could just go back to the moment of its conception and just erase it immediately. For example here, or to maybe help explain what I'm trying to talk about, when the multiple reset charges get sent back through time, they go off at the same moment relative to the TVA pocket dimension, not relative to the actual timeline they're going off in. They don't happen in succession there. They're somehow all happening simultaneously on that timeline. And again, unless I'm missing something or just plain dumb, which is possible, this is something I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around, why everything seems to revolve around the TVA pocket dimension, why the sacred timeline does not seem to be its own timeline at all. Though in this episode, it's made pretty clear that the Timekeepers don't yet know the fate of the universe or of the sacred timeline. Not to mention they seem to be keeping plenty of information from the TVA. And if I had to place any bets here, I'd say they are far sketchier than we even realize at the moment. And we'll learn more and more about them along the way. And when we do, it'll turn out that they are far from the good guys in this series. So anyway, it sounds like the Timekeepers are still determining things and that only things that have already happened are now set in stone and can't or shouldn't be changed. Which means there is a present time in this sacred timeline, right? There is a point up to which where things have actually happened and or are decided upon, and that there is still uncertainty beyond that point. Basically, the timeline is not completed if they're still deciding how it'll all end, and that maybe the present time in the sacred timeline to some extent lines up with the TVA dimension, or whatever it is exactly, that they're both moving parallel to each other somehow. But if that is the case, if they do line up and are relative to each other, why do they have to go back and get variant Loki from Endgame? Wouldn't that have already happened at a previous point in the timeline within the TVA dimension if they're lined up? In other words, how can variants emerge in the past if there is some sort of correlation between the TVA dimension and the sacred timeline? How do events change after they've actually happened the first time around and are essentially set in stone? The exception being a variant going back in time and changing things, which is happening with the other Loki, and I guess kind of makes sense there. But that doesn't explain Loki from Endgame, why that seems to happen in the past. And we know that happens in the past because we go to Earth at the year 2050 in this episode. Plus, when the timeline gets bombed, events even further in the future are affected. The only sort of explanation is that time is accelerated on the sacred timeline compared to the TVA dimension, which would make sense. Otherwise, TVA members would have already been around and doing their thing for, well, about 13 billion years since the birth of our universe, or maybe just from the point of the first life forms emerging, which who knows how many billion years ago that was. That would then mean that apparently variants don't happen very often, or nexus events, if what appears to be a relatively small TVA can handle the entire universe going at an accelerated rate. And believe me, I know I'm rambling at this point and not really explaining this very well, but I love trying to figure out these type of things. So I guess what I'm trying to say, or how I'm trying to put it, is it seems like to me the only timeline and reality that truly exists or maybe matters is the TVA, their little pocket dimension, which is kind of what Loki even says at one point, because everything that happens in the sacred timeline happens completely relative to it, and can be changed or pruned by it. But anyway, now that I've completely confused myself, and maybe you too, let's talk about Lady Loki, who I don't think is actually a variant of Loki at all, but is instead the Enchantress, or the new Enchantress, the one created by Loki, and not the original one, Amora. After all, she didn't want to be called Loki. I think that's a big clue that she's not Loki, though she did have all his mannerisms. And this all might sound just as confusing as what I was talking about before, especially considering there is a Lady Loki in the comics, and that, yes, Loki does also create a new Enchantress in the comics as well. But as I said in last week's video, my guess is that the other Loki variant is going to somehow be created or come about as a result of something that Endgame Loki variant has done or will do. But as for the episode itself, again, despite me sort of picking it apart here, don't take that the wrong way, I did find it enjoyable. I'm liking the series so far, but I have so many questions, and I'm going to be very surprised, though pleasantly surprised, if they get answered in a way that ends up giving us an airtight explanation to time travel and multiple universes, because right now, and we still have 4 episodes left, I feel like they're only going to create more questions than they could ever possibly answer. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this latest episode of Loki. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Were you confused by it? Or is this all making perfect sense to you? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Marvel. And until next time, thanks for watching.